And I'd like to start with just making sure we level set here. And there's been some discussion, as the ranking member suggested, that after a natural disaster or a significant storm, that there's media that says it occurred because of climate change. And hopefully that's not happening, and I've not seen anybody actually say that, so I would agree with them if it is being said that's incorrect. But what is correct is that climate change is causing storms and weather events to be bigger, badder, meaner, and more often. And is there anybody on the panel that disagrees with that comment? Dr. Curry does not agree with that comment. So Dr. Curry, if I understand your testimony correctly, you are suggesting that there is either no evidence of human-caused climate change or insufficient evidence of human-caused climate change. Is that correct?
No, I thought your question was specifically with regards to natural disasters and extreme weather events.
Well, let me ask you, do you believe that humankind is causing climate change?
As a scientist, believe is not in my vocabulary.
Do you have scientific data that supports the belief?
No,
the outcome, the evidence?
No, I provide assessments
of Would you agree that if we doubled the burning of fossil fuels, that would arguably increase temperatures faster in our atmosphere?
Sure. The question is how much relative to natural variability. That is the big question.
Agreed. There is natural variability. But Dr. Mann, what would your take be on that? Is there a point where we can agree that burning of fossil fuels impacts climate change and global warming?
And despite what Dr. Curry has said, there is, in fact, a robust consensus, and the various assessment reports she referred to actually demonstrate that there is a detectable human impact on these natural disasters, on hurricanes, on wildfires, et cetera. Now, when she talks about these natural cycles, and she referred to the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, well, I coined that term more than a decade and a half ago, and it is based on research that I published at the time. More recent research by my group and myself has shown that what many of these scientists are attributing to a natural cycle is, in fact, just the impact of humans on the climate, but the irregularity, because we had an increase in blocking of sunlight from pollutants in the 1950s through the 1970s, so there was sort of a plateau in warming, then it accelerated when we passed the Clean Air Acts. So if you subtract off a line, you get what looks like an oscillation left over, but it's not a real oscillation. It's just the irregularity of our impact.
Well, and you mentioned the Clean Air Act. I'm just curious because I want to have the testimony here. Climate change, global warming aside, is there anybody here that doesn't think that renewables over fossil fuels would improve the air and the health of Americans? Well, that's good to see. So, Mr. Curry, let me turn to you next. Can you elaborate more on just a better understanding of the economic and human impact due to climate change and global warming as we continue with the hockey stick that Dr. Mann has pointed out?
Yes, sir. Well, at GAO, we're the auditors of the federal government, so we approach this from the issue of the perspective of the fiscal exposure that climate change risk present to the federal government. And when I say the federal government, ultimately I also mean the taxpayer. So I'll give you a couple examples. Disaster aid is one I talked about. I mentioned the $450 billion taxpayer money that goes from the federal government to state and local entities to help response and recovery. But it's not just disaster aid. National flood insurance is backed by the U.S. taxpayer. It's $21 billion in debt. They owe the Treasury $21 billion, and that's after almost $16 billion was erased last year. It's an insolvent program. It doesn't take in enough money to cover its costs. Same with crop insurance. The list goes on in terms of the federal government's stake in this from a financial perspective.
And we're actually seeing conversations taking place right now on Wall Street that is asking that certain bonds take into effect the inherent risk of climate change. So they certainly are seeing the impact that climate change, human-caused climate change, can have on municipalities. We're also seeing the insurance industry and the real estate industry looking at the potential impact on future home sales, future home building, the ability to insure those homes in certain areas which was going to layer in additional economic costs. Often it's not going to be factored into what we look at when we look at the impact of these storms. I've got a few seconds here left. Dr. Mann, I'd just like to ask you, are there any other inconsistencies in the testimony you would like to address?
Yeah, I want to talk about the issue of wildfires, because there was this claim made that most of the increase in wildfires, in fact, I believe it was our president who claimed that it was just a matter of needing more rakes at some point. And we heard sort of a semblance of that claim earlier here in this room today. There are scientists who have very carefully looked at the impact of changing land use patterns, changing fire suppression practices, and the impact that both those factors and the human-caused factor of climate change has played. And what they conclude, if you look at the tripling, and yes, there's been a tripling in the extent of wildfire in the western U.S. over the past few decades. No more than half of that can be explained by any of these other factors. At least half of it is due to the warming and the drying and the perfect storm that creates for these massive, very fast-spreading wildfires.
And prior to the invention of rakes, what did humankind do with these forests?
Slash and burn.
Thank you. That concludes my questions.